My name is Mark Canuel. We're going to be starting in just a couple of minutes, but I wanted to welcome you back for our next panel, and for those of you who weren't with us for the Engaged Humanities Initiative sessions. We heard some amazing projects from the Engaged Humanities Initiative, students who are doing engaged work in a variety of ways for some people, and we allow people and encourage people to interpret engagement in the ways that they see fit rather than prescribing this. And so just seeing how this happens is itself really exciting. That for some, it's meant digital projects that connect artists across the Chicago arts community. For others, it involves a history of activism and protest. And so there are a lot of ways in which people are interpreting what engagement really means, and specifically what it means to be engaged at this moment. So it was a very exciting conversation. So now we're turning toward some of our faculty here at UIC and at the School of the Art Institute to talk about the way in which their work has been impacted by recent events, both the way that it's reached out, also how it is shifted or transformed in perspective in the past few months. And in order to introduce our speakers and moderate the session, I'm going to be handing things over to Laura Hostetler. Laura is a professor in the Department of History, as I mentioned before. She also was the interim director here at the Institute and guided us through these tumultuous early moments of the pandemic. And so I want to thank her again for doing that. She is a professor who specializes in Chinese history and empire. And she's also at work on a fascinating project, which many of us have heard a little bit from, a project that is a memoir about her time in northern India. And I look forward to seeing more of that. But Laura, I'm going to let you take this away and introduce our speakers.
Okay, Mark, thank you so much for those words, but also for your collegiality and your vision for this event. And thanks also to Linda for your assistance in so many ways throughout my time at the Institute, and now also with setting this up. So everyone, welcome to this first panel of the afternoon. We've entitled it Humanities During a Crisis. And it will be my privilege to introduce to you 4 scholars, each of whom has been thinking deeply about issues of justice, environment, politics, and belonging too, from different angles. And some of those words I use might surprise you a little bit, but I think they fit. So as Mark mentioned, we have 3 professors from UIC and 1 from the Art Institute of Chicago, and I will just introduce each one before they speak. Each one will have 5 to 7, I'll cut you off at 9 or 10, minutes to speak somewhat informally, discursively about how their own work as humanists intersects with or is being shaped by the current crises. And our goal here is really to spark a broader discussion regarding how the humanities disciplines in general, and we also as individuals, might more productively engage with the pressing issues of our day. So we look forward to a lively conversation with you all, as well as to the thoughts that our panelists will share. Our first speaker is David Stovall. David is professor of Black Studies in Criminology, Law, and Justice, and his scholarship has centered consistently on 3 areas: critical race theory, the relationship between housing and education, and also the intersection of race, place, and school. He is author of Born Out of Struggle, Critical Race Theory, School Creation, and the Politics of Interruption, which appeared in 2016, as well as a variety of articles and book chapters as well. Professor Stovall has recently been recognized by the American Educational Research Association through the bestowal of their 2020 Social Justice in Education Awards. Congratulations, David. And I want to say we are also very pleased to host him here at the Institute this past year. So I invite you to unmute yourself and turn the floor over to you, and I will time you.
Definitely. Thanks so much, Laura. Truly appreciate it. And just something quickly, and thanks so much to the Institute for having this in this moment. And what I just want to talk about is some of the stuff that I've been doing, and then how COVID actually comes into this space. So over the last, I should say about 15 years, I've been trying to put this thing together, but I've actually been doing this work as a lifelong Chicagoan. So it's really just kind of my ruminations as a humanistic exercise, as a lifelong Chicagoan, thinking about school closings, the destruction of public housing, and law enforcement strategies in the city. And when Laura talked about this idea of belonging, one of the things that I'm putting into question is, what does it mean to live in a space that has predetermined your disposability? So when we look at school closings in Black communities, when we look at the destruction of public housing, 99 of the Chicago Housing Authority is Black, and law enforcement strategies in particular neighborhoods in Chicago, we have to ask this question around a structural racism and a systemic racism. So, we think about these individualized acts, but when we think about a structural racism, now we have to think about what has been systemically removed and disinvested from particular communities. And then more importantly, what have those communities done in light of that disinvestment from the state, right? And then that subjection to state sanctioned violence. So and I'll just say briefly, when we think about schools, we also have to think about housing. And a good friend of mine always says, schooling is a housing issue and housing is a schooling issue. So when we think about that, all that means is when we think about where a school is, it is directly connected to what the housing stock looks like in that particular community. And when we start to look at that particular relationship, now, if we know that those two things are connected and people have been declared disposable, then there's also a rationale by law enforcement to engage those spaces that have been disinvested. Give you all a quick example. 120 schools here in Chicago do not have libraries, right? And none of these are high schools. These are all K-8 institutions. So if we think about that particular relationship and now begin to map that on to say, well, where are these communities? And what have been the history of these communities and what has actually happened with law enforcement? So if we think about COVID, it only magnifies the disparities that we've been seeing. So now, if we think about what those disparities are in the areas of education, employment, healthcare, and housing, now the COVID moment, which has locked many people in confinement in the myriad of cases, whether or not you can't go to work, whether or not your work is in a dangerous space if you're an essential worker, or if you have actually been let go from work. Now this particular moment has magnified what we've been seeing in communities. And more importantly, not just magnifying it, but exposing a broader populace to what people have been experiencing. And I think that's really important because the crisis moment of COVID has only realized that we're not in one pandemic, but we're actually in three. So if we think about the pandemic of COVID, we also have to think about its connection to the pandemics of white supremacy and capitalism. And if we're talking about school closings, the destruction of public housing, and law enforcement, those are ensconced in those three pandemics. So if we start to think about the contradictions of capital in terms of who is allowed access to particular resources and who is structurally kept away from them, then what does school look like for that particular population? And what does housing look like for that particular population? And more importantly, what are the rationalizations by the state for those particular schools and housing situations to look the way that they do? And I think with the COVID moment, because so many people have been confined to space, we're now seeing what communities have been telling us for time immemorial. The issue is, to what extension do we pay attention to it? And I'll end on this. I think this moment also, from a humanistic perspective, allows us to think about the ways in which resistance emerges. So now, as we see people in the street in relationship to state-sanctioned violence at the hands of the police, we also see people connecting this to housing, healthcare, education, and employment. So this moment of COVID now pushes our thinking to begin to engage what are our particular interrogations connected to, and how can we make that connection? Many people reference this as intersectionality, but for me, it's always the intersectionality comes in the resistance. And I think this particular moment allows us to pay deeper attention to the ways in which that resistance permeates in those communities like the ones that I've mentioned. I'll stop there because I want to be respectful of folks' time, and I want to go under my 7 allotted minutes, but hopefully that's making sense. And thank y'all again for even having someone like myself as being part of the Institute.
Thank you, David, so much. You said so much in 6 minutes, coming under time, and I'm going to use my authority as a moderator just to highlight one thing. When you talk about 3 pandemics, it just helped me to think also about different kinds of quarantine. And the COVID quarantine is just a new one that's maybe giving some of us a vocabulary and experience to understand the kinds of quarantine that other folks have been experiencing for way too long. So thank you. We'll take questions at the end. So I'm going to go on now and introduce our next speaker, Nadine Naber. Nadine Naber is Professor of Gender and Women's Studies and Global Asian Studies here at UIC. She was also the founding director and former director of the Arab American Cultural Center at UIC, and will be serving this coming year as interim director of the Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy. Nadine's research centers on the intersection of gender and justice, and has largely, although not exclusively, been conducted in Arab American communities. She's the author of Arab America, Gender, Cultural Politics, and Activism, and also co-editor of 3 additional volumes, as well as numerous articles. And she was also a fellow with us here at the Institute this past year. Nadine, you have the floor.
Thank you so much for inviting me to you and staff, of course. I will just jump off on what Dave started with around how my research all along what I've been doing with my research is, while doing my research, also trying to develop methodologies for social movement-led research. And it's been quite inspiring, as well as heartbreaking and painful to think about the current events, and how the inspiring part is that they've helped me clarify and name and claim more clearly the idea of social movement-led research as a methodology. So I thought I would, especially since we have students here, I believe, listening, I thought I would talk a little bit about humanities-based social movement-led methodology, and then some comments about my work. So jumping off again on what Dave said, I come from the interdisciplinary field of women of color feminisms, which is, and I'm always interested in tracing how academic theories, especially about power and oppression, have their roots in social movements. But these roots are often invisibilized in the way that these ideas become institutionalized in academia. So, for example, if we take the idea of intersectionality, a lot of us are familiar with, the concept actually has its roots in the 60s and 70s, especially in the Black women's liberation movement. There's a movement person named Fran Beal from that era who published a piece called Double Jeopardy in 1969. And that concept then transformed into triple jeopardy when it became part of the framing of the Third World Women's Alliance. And that is the roots of the idea that if we really want to end oppression for women of color, and of course not all women of color are the same, and I'm not going to get into all that now, but we need to take seriously multiple oppressions, and at that time it was race, class, and gender that were at the forefront of those movements. And so keeping that in mind, another woman of color feminist methodology is the idea of theory in the flesh, which is the idea that theories are born out of lived experiences, which is very much a feminist methodology, but also a woman of color feminist methodology. And I think about that concept in terms of the simple idea that everyone has a theory and a method. You don't have to be a professor to be seen as a theorist. And then we need to be willing to, name our radical theories and methods on our own terms beyond the boundaries of conventional academic disciplines. And that kind of uplifts and opens up a more expansive way of thinking about what theory making is. And so out of those kind of core beliefs of mine, I've been trying to develop a methodology for social movement-led research that I'm now, for the sake of shorthand, I'm going to call, and I've been trying to call, the 3 R's of social movement-led research. And I'll put out these R's for you. So one is respectful. And the concept of respectful research is basically around building trust. And this is around research with movements and with communities, for those interested in those kinds of research projects. So the idea of respectful research is just around building trust and accountability, that takes seriously the idea of decolonizing the power relations between researchers and research participants. And then the second R is relational, and that's where I uplift the idea of intersectional research that we've been talking about. But intersectionality and taking seriously race, class, and gender isn't only about analyzing power, it's also about connecting communities and struggles. Because once you pay attention to the multiplicity of power relations, you can then notice points of unity and points of connection across communities by paying attention to all those complexities. It opens up, for example, connections across racial struggles. I won't go into all that now, but that helps us get out of an oppression Olympics model and think more about how we have shared struggles based on shared relationships to power structures. And then and that can be an example of, if we're thinking about Chicago right now, we are seeing the militarization of police. We just saw it this past week with the Department of Homeland Security coming into Chicago. And my hope is that we can then think, how does the militarization of police and the Homeland Security, those forces inspire us to think about the connections between war and the war on terror, which is a global issue, and then the local issue of Chicago with police violence. And then that can inspire connections across, for example, Arab struggles and Black struggle. And then the third for the 3 R's would be revolutionary. And by that, I mean research for the purposes of social change and social justice. And what I think the challenge there is, and I'll just close on this, is that what we want to think about then is not to think of social movements and research or the concept of engaged research as if research and activism are separate. This is what I'm trying to think about now. For example, I don't want to think about, okay, I'm going to do my research and then I'm going to contribute it to a social movement or a community organization. And I can, in the question answer, I can tell you why I don't want to do it that way. But instead, I want to think about how we can craft research projects where the activism and the research are co-constituted and are conducted simultaneously, so that the movement-based theories and methods that we've been talking about, how we want to think about social movement actors as theorists on their own terms, are integrated into the research all along. And the example that I have for that is my new project about the impact of state violence on mothers who are impacted by the war on terror, by the undocumented struggle, and by police violence. This is my new project, and I've tried to, thanks to the Institute of Humanities, I had a chance to develop this project around in ways that try to implement the methodology that I just shared with you. So I can direct you to the website of the project. It's Mothering is Radical. If you're interested in more on that. I'm sorry, I wanted to tell you more about the project, but I don't want to go over the time. So I'll just say in closing that some of the components of the project entail amplifying the voices of mothers, for example, of police torture survivors in Chicago, and uplifting their voices in the campaigns that they're interested in, whether that's, seeking pardons from the governor for, police torture survivors or et cetera. And in the process of amplifying their voices to uplift their campaigns, there's also the process of uplifting their analyses of state violence and policing as the leading voices in the theories that the project is producing. So thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Nadine. It's really exciting to hear both about theory and the specific project. And some of what you say, I think, about individual voices and actors as theorists resonate with some of what we heard at this morning's panel also. How do we not divorce our ways of knowing, but bringing them together? I think it's so important in breaking down segregation of the mind as well as what's lived out. But I'm pleased now to introduce our third speaker, Ralph Cintron. Ralph Cintron is professor of English and Latino and Latin American Studies and is currently also serving as director of the Latin American and Latino Studies program here at UIC. He has a broad range of interests, which encompass rhetorical studies, urban ethnography, and the evolution of political ideology. His extensive ethnographic fieldwork in Puerto Rican and Mexican neighborhoods in Chicago has engaged issues of housing, labor, and immigration, as well as the transnational forces, both political and economic, that are part and product of these neighborhoods. His most recent book, Democracy is Fetish, appeared in December of 2019. Professor Cintron was recently elected as Fellow of the Rhetoric Society of America, the highest award that the organization provides. Congratulations, Ralph. You have the floor.
First of all, I'm just so happy to be here. I just completely admire the Institute. I think it's one of the fantastic places. I really respect the work of David and Nadine a lot, so that's also another pleasure. So and Shiben lives just upstairs, one floor up. Really happy to be here. So I think I can get this done quickly. I have a text in front of me, so this is going to be a little different. So let me see if I can get this done. Scene one. According to the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, the planet's extremely hot zones, such as the Sahara Desert, could expand from 1% of today's land surface to about 1/5 of the land by 2070. That is, 1 out of every 3 people will be outside the climate niche that has governed us for thousands of years. The supposition here, of course, is that many of these people will become climate migrants. Scene 2. Between the summers of 1997, 1998, overlogging and fires in Southeast Asia drove fruit bats from their native forests to orchards that bordered the forests. Below some of the orchard trees were pig farms. The Nipah virus spread from the bats to the fruit, to the pigs, and then to humans. The Nipah virus, along with rabies, Ebola, Marburg, SARS, MERS, Hendra, COVID viruses, are some of the most lethal zoonotic viruses that have entered human populations. It turns out that human alteration of natural habitat, along with global warming, is bringing virus reserves or reservoirs closer to where humans live, and thus accelerating what is called spillover, where viruses jump from wild animals to domestic animals and then to humans, and maybe back again. Scene 3. On the night of the first uprising, I am watching Fox News as they report on what they call looting and destruction of Chicago. They distinguish between legitimate and moral protesters and illegitimate, immoral ones. They distinguish between white anarchists hijacking the protests versus peaceful and legitimate protesters in the name of George Floyd and others. Of course, MSNBC is doing much the same. I am not surprised by the ideological confluence of the cable channels. Further, it seems to me that the sharp distinction between the legitimate and illegitimate is both inevitable and revealing. So these 3 scenes are simply local versions of a deeper structural problem, in my view. I, along with a few others, have been trying to describe this structure for some years. We are trying to develop what we call a theory of volatility. The 3 scenes above represent interlocking volatilities, one volatility cascading into the next until we arrive at the problem of sovereign rule. Can the sovereign maintain order, or does it give way to the volatility itself? I think the discussions this summer around abolition and the carceral state, which David was part of, have been on point. The uprisings around George Floyd are a continuation of historical uprisings against what I have been calling the, quote, oligarchic condition as embodied by the nation state. Some of these historical uprisings include the slavery revolts of the 19th century, the Paris communes of 1848 and 1871, along with the different European uprisings during that same period. Each of these moments are signs that the prior uprisings were never completed. That is, the fact of BLM tells us that the civil rights marches of the 1950s remain unfinished. And the civil rights marches themselves tell us that the slavery revolts were also unfinished from the 19th century. Similarly, the various Latin American liberation movements have been attempts to solve what was never put into place during the national independence movements of the 19th century. All of these movements then represent a vast call and response across centuries and across peoples and locations. I want to present a disturbing economic estimate. According to economists from Vanderbilt, University of Tennessee, and the National Bureau of Economic Research, in 1870, 5 years after the abolishment of slavery in the United States, African Americans' per capita income was approximately 28% of whites' income. By 2010, it was 64%. In other words, if in 1870 Black income was less than 1/3 of white income, 140 years later, it was slightly less than 2/3. Here's another disturbing bit of economic analysis. The economist Walter Scheidel in The Great Leveler examines the economic data available from Paleolithic times to our own and concludes that democratic forces do not of themselves mitigate inequality. Only the most leveling forms of violence accomplish that. And he names state collapse, violent revolutions, mass warfare, and pandemics. Yes, pandemics. And The Great Leveler was published in 2017. So I want to put the historical uprisings of the last few centuries alongside the economic information that I just presented. It seems to me that they are implicit criticisms of Martin Luther King's famous, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." Michelle Obama also referenced that. Is the universe really a moral entity? What is the justice that he names? When the abolition movement or BLM critiqued the carceral state, which I agree with that critique, is this a deep critique of the nation state whose main function perhaps is the preservation of the oligarchic condition as the source of national wealth? Or is it a reformist movement that wants to deepen citizenship rights? I'm afraid I think it is more of the latter. This brings me finally to the climate migrants that may be so much a part of our planetary future. Can progressive values, democratic values, conservative values, nativist values accommodate millions of people undergoing widespread state collapse? My own sense is that the differences between political values will converge in order to reaffirm and strengthen the idea of the nation state. In other words, the carceral state will become even more dominant in the name of self-defense. In order to face the volatility of millions of people on the move, it will become even more lethal and volatile. That's speculative, of course. Will this sense of uprooted people who cannot afford to stay in place challenge to its very core the very idea of the nation and the state? It is possible then that we might face a different kind of uprising than the historical ones mentioned earlier. Mere reform of the nation state may no longer be on the table. Mere petitioning for citizen rights to the nation may no longer be the goal. How will the global oligarchy respond? Will they increase their guardianship over their accumulations? Will the ensuing volatility do them in? Will volatility itself become sovereign?
Thank you. That gives a lot to think about. Great. I'm going to introduce our fourth and final speaker, but I also want, as I do that, to just let you know procedurally what we'll be doing is taking questions via the chat. So if things start to formulate, it's fine to start accumulating some of those questions now. But allow me to introduce Professor Shiben Banerji. Shiben Banerji has a passion for bringing the humanities into conversation with public policy. Assistant Professor of Art History, Theory, and Criticism at the Art Institute of Chicago, he was also a visiting fellow here at the Institute for Humanities this past year. Banerji describes himself as, quote, an urban designer and historian. His forthcoming book, Lineages of the Global City, Occult Modernism and the Spiritualization of Democracy, aims to reconstruct, and I quote, a transnational network of artists, architects, pacifists, and anti-colonials who produced city design and development as a method for cultivating a new democratic subject. Welcome, Shiben.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you, Mark and Linda, for convening this very important summit. I want to bring together some insights from political economy, philosophical materialism, and moral psychology to raise a doubt about the humanities as an instrument of social justice, and to suggest instead how humanistic and artistic inquiry can cultivate the will for social justice. Humanities research does not take place in a vacuum. When a museum or research university acts as a real estate developer acquiring distressed parcels of land in its vicinity, it perpetuates the structural underdevelopment of that neighborhood. Removing land and buildings from the local property tax base weakens services and those who can leave the neighborhood. The plot thickens when we consider that the debt fueling real estate speculation is subsidized by US military aggression overseas. Now, the point in raising this isn't to name or shame our employers or apply ideological tests to them. I'm saying this really as a way of trying to define a mode of inquiry that sets apart the temptation to refer to the humanities as an omnibus for universal values and a mode of inquiry that would allow us to not only recognize that what it is to be human, is a classic subject of the humanities, is to be a being that perceives value subjectively. That ethical, aesthetic, and material value impels us to act. And so in analyzing the myriad ways in which subjects evaluate demands that they encounter in the world, those of us in the arts and humanities also then have a responsibility to sympathetically shift these different subjective modalities of apprehending value in the world. I want to focus on desire as one particular modality of apprehending value. So one of the most dubious and at the same time productive assumptions of our modernity is that desires inhere in us, when in fact a desire is necessarily a response to something that we subjectively find valuable in the world. It is because we often presume that desires are self-standing impulses that reside in the human mind, that the pursuit of a desire turns out to be alienating. And so the pursuit of wealth, for example, is Marx's parade example of this dynamic. Fourth chapter, the chapter on the general formula in the first volume of Capital. And what he's describing there is that a capitalist, in pursuing a desire that they have naturalized, that is to say, their own naturalization of their subjectivity as acquisitive, ends up then turning them into a servant of capital. So this is the basic structure in which a desire becomes alienating. And I'm saying it has something, Marx is a very specific sophistication of this qua labor. And one must, of course, remember there are a variety of capitalist subjects, willing and unwilling. But there's something far more fundamental that he's also tracking, which is the way in which we have simply frameworked our relations in the world in such a way that we really have come to think that the world doesn't exist. And I hope that this opens an avenue to the preceding talks, all three of them, and certainly to what Ralph raises as volatilities. So how might artists and critics guard against a desire for social justice becoming alienating? I think to begin with, we should not invoke the desire for social justice as a standalone virtue. It must be cast as a response to evaluative demands that we encounter in the world. So therefore, the contingency of my response must force me to reckon with the related intentional states of mind that might infirm my desire for social justice, such as the fact that I teach and desire to teach at an art school supported by a tax-free endowment. So let me very quickly, and I don't want to take more than a minute to do this, present one very, very basic illustration of what it might mean to shift humanistic work in this way, or rather to cast humanistic inquiry and humanistic activism. Again, I hope this connects with the very important points that Nadine raised, using an illustration that I think contains all of the claims that I've here made, and it has to do with a person that we might encounter on the street or even in an enclosed space who refuses to wear a face mask. So a person declares that wearing a face mask is coercive and unmanly. I think it is vile to call such a person vile. It is also a grotesque abdication of responsibility, and as such is fundamentally undemocratic. Instead, why not engage with their understanding of freedom and masculinity? Doing so, they might be persuaded to see that their own desire to appear manly is affirmed by a related desire to be esteemed by others. Shifting their desires, in this case their inclination toward others, can be used to foster regard for others' health and safety. Similarly, their desire to be free can be used to cultivate a desire for self-governance or a reflexive awareness of one's impact on others. And again, I think this gets to the heart of the questions that Ralph left us with over the impossibility of the exercise of sovereignty in the name of the public as actually able to contain various volatilities. So I'm saying that it's in that view that we have to undertake an incredible theoretical act through daily practice of reimagining freedom as self-governance. Engaging with the detail of a conflicting point of view cannot be conceived of as an instrumental act. All we can do is to yearn to understand what someone else means while entertaining the doubt that we have understood what they meant. If we can convey that yearning, we will have modeled the will for social justice. In other words, we can pursue social justice by not by making others like us or by appealing to universal values. Social justice necessarily entails struggling to engage difference on its own terms. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Just need to finish jotting something down there. What I would like to do before accepting questions or as questions come in from our larger audience is to maybe open a little bit to the panelists themselves in case they would have remarks or questions for each other, or if Mark would like to dive in too, that this would maybe be a time, set some parameters, and then I will read the questions as they come through in the chat and invite you to respond to those. Does that sound good? Great. I know there's your comments are all, I feel, very distilled. So in a sense, it's almost like I think we need a little time to digest, but there's some very interesting ways in which the kinds of issues that you're bringing up, I think you may be coming from different places, but engaging certainly some of the same questions or issues. So putting Ralph together with David, we are not experiencing collapse, but consolidation. Is all chaos organized? So I guess the question is like, where is this going?
Yeah. Well, and thanks so much for that, Mark. I think in thinking about this moment, always think about there is a very narrow window for things to actually happen that will be just towards the people who have experienced the injustice, right? So when you think about Nadine's work, when you think about movement-based work, and you think about movements, and you think about people who are doing organizing more fugitively, there's this very narrow window that people can now begin to move things differently. And that's never judged by the decision of government, right? So if we, for example, like when we hear things about defunding the police and we see that a lot of local school councils have voted to not have police in their building, that's not a response by government, right? Much of this happens in spite of government, right? So these are people who have made a decision to say, we are only placing this demand on where we are. We have made this demand and we have moved on this demand based on the various structures and powers. If we choose to do something else, then we will do something else, hence that fugitivity. And this thing around, is all chaos organized? I don't think it's necessarily organized, but I think we should understand the chaos as response, right? So chaos as responding to the current moment, and then where people take it is also critical in terms of what decisions are made to make sure that the demands are met, right? Because this is the thing: is this a demand of government? Or is this a demand of abolition, right? To say that government is not working, that reform is too short. So this thing around really pushing that envelope. And I think these are the questions that people are asking in real time on the street.
Yeah, I don't know if I don't know if I necessarily have a response to Mark's question. First of all, I think David is completely right. There's just such a small window in which things, one can respond. I think my frustration has been in looking at this kind of like long history of uprisings, is looking precisely at that the responses they kind of explode in front of our faces, and then they very quickly begin to wilt. And the forces that be, so to speak, and I think most of us are thinking about capital, but obviously there are other kinds of consolidations of capital and power, and so on and so on. Those forces return, and they return very quickly. And I think partly in my imagination, at least, because I think quite a bit about anthropology and I try to think quite a bit about equality, there are very few societies that kind of engage in a kind of genuine equality. And those that do are largely nomadic, and that's because they cannot accumulate. As long as the conditions for accumulation are possible, I am deeply skeptical that we can suddenly remove ourselves or reform the problems of accumulation. I think that's, I don't know that I've been able to wrap my head around another way of envisioning these things. So I think in there, I think is the start of my skepticism.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to another question to share here. This is from Yasmin Nair. And this is directed towards Shiben Banerji. And it's about the point about engaging non-maskers. So the question brings it, I think, from the theoretical to the moment, the physical. How exactly, she asks, is this to happen in a physical situation that often results in intimidation and even death by infection? How do you take class and gender differences into account with this kind of a scenario?
Thank you. It's a very generous question that helps me clarify and amplify certain things that I said and left unsaid. I think the first thing to know is that I chose that illustration not merely because of its topicality, but because often the presumption, and it's embedded in Yasmin's question, is that in seeking to engage someone who's not wearing a mask, the desire is to preserve life. For instance, to preserve my own life, or maybe somebody else in the room, though that's, I would argue, very rarely the case. I'm saying, no, actually, that can't be the desire. And it certainly can't be framed in the instrumentalizing way that the question presumes. And that, to me, only sort of speaks to how much work we have to do, not merely in the conceptualization, but in the experimentation in physical space. And that experimentation has to entertain the possibility of the loss of life. You can't actually hold life itself as a value. But the desire to save another life, potentially even a non-human life, is an admirable value. So that's one, I think, really important distinction to hold in mind. To the point on differences of, among other things, class and gender, that's of course the entire point of the focus on the various subjective ways in which a person finds something in the world to be desirable. As in this instance, finding not wearing a mask to be more desirable than wearing a mask. I used a kind of cartoonish, oversimplified illustration by putting it in terms that are familiar because of the topicality of manliness, but that isn't to somehow suggest that that's a constraint on the illustration. It was just to add contingency to it. Does that begin to offer some clarity as to what I was getting at?
We can, I guess, see that response from the questioner, maybe if she wants to do that by chat. For me, I think the question that this also brings up is one of, well, there are two. And I think that one of these questions is something that, Nadine, you probably encounter in your research, but others of you may also, and that's the question of relative status or position when we come into confrontation with someone with different views. Or David, too, would have something, I think, to say on this. When does it make sense to engage, and when does it make sense to maybe pull back or wait or use another medium to engage rather than maybe saying something in that moment? But I think the other question this also brings up is, let's see if I can translate my thought into words. I would say one of the values of humanities approaches is the openness to hear about different experience. And the different experience, I think, is related to different perspectives. So there's a kind of almost automatic value in some degree of relativity, right? But there's some things on which we are not willing to compromise, you know? So there's also, I think, a philosophical question of how we navigate that line. And it certainly relates to social justice. It certainly relates to health. And I think that's why the events of these past few months are just so, have us so much on edge, if you will. Thoughts?
May I just offer one further clarification, because this is partly sparked. I'm looking at the chat window. It's partly sparked also by something that Mark has added himself. What I'm arguing for is not common ground. Again, I'm not arguing to say that the task is somehow to convert someone who's not wearing a mask to the position of wearing a mask. I'm saying that we have to be able to model certain habits of judgment that contain in them something that is actually attractive and seductive enough that might encourage someone to give up a particular attachment. And to what Ralph is saying on the collapse of sovereignty and the possibility that it's only in the lack of possession and accumulation that equality can be pursued toward something like an unalienated life. This has all been extensively thought through by someone like Gandhi. he precisely says the self is the only sovereign site. That's why I'm saying that liberty itself has to be, with a lot of work, and in Gandhian terms, with experiments, has to be completely rethought as self-governance. But at the heart of that has to be a willingness to dispose of one's own life without taking another. That is extremely hard. There's an almost glibness to the way I'm articulating it, but that shouldn't undermine how difficult the task is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let's see. I'd like to go ahead and read a number of questions and comments that have come in, and then we can come back to them, because I'm afraid otherwise I'll miss something. One question: how can we use dominant aesthetic values as a tool to liberate oppressed communities? That's one, also in response to Shiben's remarks. A response to this earlier question we've been dealing with: the pandemic is entirely different historically and conceptually. It really does require us to rethink the concept of life, death itself. This isn't just about different views. AIDS shifted our boundaries of thinking about the imminence of death. The pandemic does the same thing, and I don't want to make any easy analogies here. And then another comment from Mark: I like the way that Nadine's account opens a window for how you'd look across differences to find common ground. Yeah. If participants are willing to think about how the pandemic shifts things, we need to think about the difference. Okay. Okay. So there are a few comments. Welcome more, but also discussion, responses.
Laura, just something quick, and I'm willing to go hard. I don't know if that, I'm here in a Humanities Institute, so I don't know if folks will describe this as hard left, but in response to Sabrina Gregg's question, right? How can we use dominant aesthetic values as a tool to liberate oppressed communities? I'm going to go a little further and say you can't, right? I mean, you can use it as a question. You can use it in questions of critique. You can use it as a mode of critique, but the mode of the oppressor will never be used to free those who are experiencing oppression under those terms, right? So it has to be, when we talk about a radical break, there has to be a questioning of what these normalized views are in order for folks to visualize or envision something that is liberatory according to meeting the expressed needs of that particular community, right? Because I think this is always a problem, and this is what the people like yourself, Laura, who study colonization, like this is always a question, right? Are the values of Western Europe relative to my concern in my particular locale, right? And those things around really being clear about that in many cases, and I would argue that that should not be the approach, and that we should have this questioning, and at the same time looking at the ways in which people respond to their conditions as the baseline, going back to Nadine's point, as the baseline for determining what the justice condition will be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and part of the way I hear what you're saying, it's not about how can we liberate you? It's about how do we stop oppressing other people, right? Those with power. So anyway, yeah. I think, Ralph, you wrote a comment here, and I'll read it since it's in the chat, because I'm always interested in how right-wing groups make their arguments. How do we do relational field work with folks who might hate us? How does Nadine's model fit into this sort of thing? So say we wanted to go into a community of people who didn't want to wear masks for whatever reason. We don't understand that. They don't have a resonance with the values of the kind of scholarship we do. How does that work? Right? I think that's what you're asking. Yeah.
And I could chime in. I probably won't answer the question directly. I think it's a very important question. What I can say is that my approach would be to build a base with people who do want to create, justice and freedom for all people. And in that way, that by default allows for, creating the change and dismantling these oppressive forces we're talking about. So in other words, rather than thinking about how do we go and engage with, hateful people, that just feels really unsafe. And I don't know how much that will achieve the goal. I think rather I would put my attention into building up power. And that's where I would distinguish between activism and organizing, where organizing is about, working with people, with communities, rather than just, people who are already converted, going to a protest, which is really important, but it's definitely not going to lead us where we want to go. But then I would also add that I think it's just really important when we think about, as we're talking about basically some of the question on the table earlier, which I think led to Ralph's point partly, is this concept of relational, right? And how do we work across difference? And I think it's really important to get us out of a liberal model when we think about difference, because, we want to make sure we're all talking about the same thing here, or not. Just to clarify, what are we talking about when we say difference? So when I'm talking about relational organizing or activism or even research, I'm thinking of dismantling white supremacy and capitalism and racial capitalism and colonization. So in that sense, when we talk about relational, the relational is not about similarity necessarily. So it's not to say, for example, when people say in 2014, Gaza looked really similar to Ferguson, right? I think that's useful. Okay, that's a basis. We might join forces across from Palestine to Ferguson, but I actually think that the similarity argument isn't as strong for mobilization. The joint struggle approach, alternatively, is about finding the ways that the struggles are already interconnected. So in other words, rather than saying, oh, look, Ferguson, the tanks in Ferguson look like the tanks in Gaza, and therefore we should help each other, which is really important. We should share tactics about how to respond to tear gas because we're both facing the tear gas, right? But even more powerfully, I think, is about saying, well, some of the police in Ferguson were actually trained in Israel. So, the police forces are already working together. And that connection to me means that, for example, US imperialism has already connected Black and Palestinian struggle. These struggles are already connected. It's not like we're saying, let's connect our struggles. They're already connected. The question is, how are we going to then catch up, And so that said, a crucial point, I think, for responding to what's been said is that then what do we do about differences, right? And by using a joint struggle framework that allows us to, so if we say that, let me be clear, I don't want to talk too long. So if white supremacy and imperialism, so let me say it differently. If we're talking about the Gaza and Ferguson example, for example, it doesn't mean that the oppression of Palestinians is therefore the same as the oppression of Black folks in Ferguson. There's imperialism and colonization in one situation that works according to a whole different logic, as Andrea Smith writes in the 3 Pillars of White Supremacy, that form of oppression is a different logic. It's about anti-Arab racism and anti-Muslim racism is very different than anti-Black racism without going into all that. So we're not saying that the oppression is the same, but what we're saying is that the struggles are intertwined. And that allows us to then look at the differences and the possibility for solidarity. And then if we take that approach, we do have to address the differences, because the differences are not just about, difference, they're about power. So when some middle-class Palestinians immigrate to the United States, they might enact anti-Black racism because they're being brought into the United States through a different structure, a different racial logic that then puts them in a position of power in relation to, let's say, working class Black communities. So that's kind of what I'm saying about joint struggle being about points of unity, where the struggles do intertwine, but then simultaneously being able to also simultaneously struggle with these power differences that also exist across communities. And another example would be the slogan, "No ban on stolen land." When folks organized against the Muslim ban, there were posters that said, "No ban on stolen land." So what does that mean? It means that, yes, there's a possibility for solidarity, but it also means that immigrants in this example need to take seriously that they're coming to land, they're participating in a settler project. So then what does that mean? Are we going to then turn to the United States government for our rights as immigrants, or are we going to turn to Native American communities and leaders in that community and say, how do we, deal with coming here to this land? What would you, what's your, are you welcoming us here? And if so, what are the terms upon which we engage with this land? So that'd be an example of similarity and difference in a not liberal way. If that makes sense.
I also think there are kind of two things going on here, and absolutely there are differences in the way that, in terms of what allies may have experienced and where their positionality might be. But then it's a whole nother question, I think, is part of what Shiben was trying to get at, is how does one, as a researcher, get into the mind of, say, the white supremacist, right? Whereas you would say, no, the goal is to resist and fight it, right? So I have to think of the research of Tarini Bedi in anthropology, for example, who did her first book project on elite Hindu women in India who supported the BJP. So she had to go, she had to have tea with them, she had to get to know them, she had to, let them hold her baby, etc. Because she was trying to understand how that worked and what made them tick, which doesn't mean that she was at all sympathetic to the political agenda. So that's a very different kind of inquiry and project. And I think, it's certainly also worthy, but I think there's room for a variety of approaches. But this also gets to the question of what that came up. Jenny Breyer posted something here, more of a comment. She says, this also raises the stakes for what it means to be engaged humanities, community engagement. Where is organizing as a method in the way we talk about the engaged humanities, which is also connected, she says, to Banerji's point. So, Frida Sanchez Vega writes, I understand the differences of oppressions, but then how do you get to create empathy and equality from the people who have the power? If we don't engage from people from opposite viewpoints, how can we change their minds? Or is revolution the only way? And then Mark also raises another question, is organizing the telos of engaged humanities? So I throw that out to all of you.
Well, this this, to Frida Sanchez Vega's point, this thing around, it's not about conversion, right? And I think this is, and I'm going back to, I'm pulling from Nadine's point. It's not necessarily around people coming to your side, right? It's really around putting it out there that there's been populations of folks who have been ignored, and they have actually put forward them being ignored and the response around being ignored, while also rooting that in history, right? So if we think about the history of the United States, its foundational principles, although we never talk about this, its foundational principles are wrongful land appropriation, genocide, and slavery, right? Those weren't asides, right? Those were foundational to the founding of this place. And if we can't have that conversation, then I don't know where we go, right? So this piece around revolution, right? This thing around asking the question, reform is not enough, right? This idea of saying that there are good systems and bad people, right? And I think that that's the question that we have to interrupt. Can we dare say that there are bad systems, right? And those systems do not need to exist, right? And I think this is the broader question of abolition. When we say these systems have historically never been intended to work outside of the construct of white supremacy. So now, if they have never been intended to work outside of that construct, then why would we try to make that thing that's rooted in the separation of groups and the actual dislodging and disinvesting and marginalization of groups? Why is the expectation that that is something to be reformed, right? And what we see right now with the overturn of the Lomachenko government in Eastern Europe is folks just saying enough is enough, right? There are tens of thousands of people who are meeting in the street every day saying this isn't working, right? And we have to have something else. Now, there's a contradiction in that, right? Because they may be arguing that Lomachenko is a bad person and democracy is the ultimate goal. But I think this thing around, we have to ask this question, democracy for whom? Under what terms? Does this limit our capacity to engage in any form of self-determination? And if it does, who determines those means? So, I think this, to Frida's point, we have to consider revolution that cannot be outside of our justice condition. And I think this is something that we have to entertain, but we also have to entertain the idea of what that means, because we've just seen this in Mali, right? So in Mali, now we've seen a military coup, but the military coup actually framing itself as responding to the will of the people. Right. So, and again, there's a contradiction in terms of empire and military might. So what does that actually mean in terms of moving forward? And are we in such a bizarro moment that the military presents the will of the people more so than a quote unquote elected government? Right. So again, we have to engage those contradictions. And I think we can't take revolution out of our equation.
As far as engaged humanity goes, just a quick comment that there are many, many, many different forms of engaged research, as we know, right? So I just want to keep that on the table, that, it could mean like writing a policy report or giving communities tools to do their own research, or doing research and then that will go towards a campaign goal or movement goal. Getting funding for someone in a community to publish their own book with their own voice and analysis. I'm sure there are many, many more. And the policy example I started with could be, like working with the United Nations to, have people in a community, to amplify their voice in some policy change that you want to see happen. And then the research part could entail studying that process. So let's say you meaning that in one case you could do research and give it to someone, or you could give people tools to do organizing and you could study the organizing they do. There's just so many ways of thinking about it. So I think that that's a beautiful thing. And that's something, we should just keep creating more methodologies and possibilities rather than thinking that engaged humanities has to be one thing. Storytelling, there's so many things.
And Laura, just a point of clarification, when I was talking about the Lukashenko government, I'm talking about the current uprising in Belarus.
Okay.
May I just offer a dispute? And I'm not saying it's a dispute between David and myself, but I think that there is a disagreement between us that's worth pursuing. And it's something as simple as this. Who are the revolutionaries? Right? I completely agree that we don't take revolution off the table, but the question really is who is going to actually do the overturning, right? So already in the word revolution, in the notion of radical, in the notion of overturning, there's already a very strange afterlife of the diggers, strange afterlife of some peculiar events in the 1640s in a small part of the world. And what is it to somehow assume that that vocabulary is available? That already, to me, begins to get into the question of who will be the revolutionary. So in the case of the diggers, in the case of subsequent revolutions, say, for example, the revolution in Iran in the 70s, there are a number of scripts being mobilized that are in fact highly shared, right? So the diggers, among others, are making reference to the fact that nothing in law can be actually found in the Bible. We always talk, some colleagues of mine are in this venue, so they'll have heard me say this before. We always talk about the First Amendment in the US. I'm a non-citizen, but because I work on the US, I have to know these things. We talk about the First Amendment, but we don't seem to realize that it is given the priority it is, because the first law of censorship was an act of heresy in England in 1401, which banned the possession of the Bible. Because to own Wycliffe's Bible would be to know that things as they stand cannot be. Sort of mucking up John Ball's words. But this is to say that I'm actually not sure that revolution is necessarily in itself an oppositional act. I'm not even sure that oppositional acts occur without a shared discursive framework. To me, all of this then gets to a very, very basic question, or a further basic question from the one I started with, which was who will be the revolutionary? See, if we presume that people will oppose because it is in their interest, then we do them a great disservice, because at this point in the world, almost no one has any property. They have no property-based interests as such. There have been other ways of trying to formulate something like an interest group in order to negotiate with competitive politics. And so the formation of certain kinds of identitarian claims takes that genealogy. But I think to presume that interest and desire is the same thing is to, first of all, conceptually, that's just incorrect. But it's also, I think, to, in the current moment, to do a great disservice to people who are demonstrating and demanding not merely what might constitutionally be available to them by right, but in fact demanding things of the state, to all the points that David opened with. And here now I'm actually showing that we're much more in agreement than I may have permitted the previous remarks to show, that in fact there is a series of demands being made that are of such a nature that the state cannot actually accept them, that they're too fundamental to the challenge, too fundamental a challenge to the state's monopolist function, their monopoly on violence, to accept something like a world without police, a world without prisons. It's too foundational. But I don't believe that saying it's too foundational immediately means that we presume that it has to be smashed. Because I think, not because I want it retained, I am a firm prison abolitionist, It's that I think we lose too many steps along the way of basically asking who will do the work and why would they do it, and why should we presume that they have an interest to do it when they have no property. So it's in that sense that I'm saying we have to cultivate the desire and the will for social justice, but to see in that desire, that intentional state of mind, that will exists on multiple sites and is affirmed and infirmed by numerous other related desires. And most among these, I'm increasingly, sort of again, I suppose, coming to me via Gandhi, but also the person to whom Gandhi attributed it in many ways, which is John Ruskin, is a very Victorian view of the world. We're so damn committed to our own convenience, it actually makes the pursuit of justice impossible. We see in convenience a beautiful and elegant solution that it makes it such that we just give up and say, yeah, the courts will handle it, right? And this is expressed in the rhyming schemes that are at the foundation of criminal law in the United States, right? So Jefferson's bill proportioning crimes heretofore capital. He's referring to proportionality. He's referring to a rhyming scheme, which then becomes, don't do the crime if you can't do the time and other shit like that. It's so fundamental, and it has allowed itself to remain fundamental because we're so addicted to our own convenience.
Can I respond a little bit? I know that I can't be as eloquent as Shiben was just right now. I thought it was some of the remarkable things that he said there. This has been an interesting discussion, and I've been trying to digest, many of its bits and pieces. At one point, David says we do need to entertain the hard left. And I think my overall argument was, yes, I agree that we do need to entertain the hard left. But then what was so interesting, that even as I agreed with David at that moment, Shiben's point about not being sure about the nature of revolution, I would have to agree with that as well. And the reason why is because I have been conceiving of revolution of late as being a kind of constant repairing of modernity in some fashion or another. In other words, an uprising appears, but what's the nature of that uprising? The nature of that uprising is to repair some kind of fault within modernity. And oftentimes that's a lack of rights, for instance, or in some fashion or another, it's the creation of a nation state for people who don't have a nation state. So a revolution appears, like under colonialism, for example. So if we take that into consideration, that some kind of skepticism about revolution itself, and yet that there is maybe even some necessity for the hard left, again, to dislodge the accumulations of capital, the extreme accumulations of capital. And now we're talking about, global oligarchies. But at the same time, Shiben's answer to much of this seems to me that it's a kind of like an internal transformation which needs to occur. Maybe that's a very simplistic sort of way. And I have to admit, I'm kind of convinced about that. At the same time, I find myself coming from a different position. As Shiben admits, the internal revolution, so to speak, is very difficult to accomplish. The external revolution, the hard left position that David has been talking about, seems to be a continuation or repairing of modernity. I find myself at this point, and maybe I'm becoming kind of apocalyptic, I don't know. I am finding myself at this point thinking, coming from a different place. And that's a place in which the human is no longer under control or in control of the change. In other words, the change is becoming so fantastically enormous that it simply imposes itself upon all forms of heretofore forms of sovereignty, namely the political orders that modernity itself has devised: socialism, communism, anarchism, liberal democracy. So there's a sense of a kind of sovereignty which undoes all forms of prior sovereignty. Now, where does that get us? What sort of world is that? And yet, when we think about climate change, that's almost the envisioning which is beginning to appear from scientists, from humanists. And so I don't know where we're at 150 years from now. I really don't. But I think it's a strong possibility that this new sovereign, which is beginning to emerge, is something that will undo even the sorts of optimisms, the utopianisms that revolution so often foregrounds.
This feels like ominous last words. Would anybody else like to
Definitely appreciate you, Ralph.
to another place? No. That's a morsel of hope.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you, Ralph. And then, Shiben, I agree that we don't actually disagree on too many points.
No, we don't.
I really appreciate this point around who are the revolutionaries. Mm-hmm. I think that's the critical question that we have to engage, right? We cannot leave that hanging, right? Because when we start to say, who are these revolutionaries? Now we are asking a totally different question around the self and who we are connected to, right? And that's
right. It's fundamentally in a social setting. And that would be the only qualification I would add to what Ralph is saying. Is that indeed I am saying that after Gandhi, we would want the self to be the only locus of sovereignty, precisely because there can be no locus of sovereignty, right? So for him, this is explicitly religiously formulated, because nothing is actually sovereign other than God, however that's understood. Only the self can contain it. And then within political Islam, Maududi in the same generation will say that, all Gandhi is right. All violence is because governments claim sovereignty. So yes, I think the struggle to reimagine. I know Laura's calling time. The struggle to reimagine ourselves as subjects rather than agents of social justice, which was sort of the highlight of what I was saying, and you could substitute social justice with revolution. The subjects of the revolution rather than agents of it. In the communist theory, there is no agent of the revolution. That is necessarily the social struggle. And I am putting that the only thing attractive about democracy, as far as I can tell, is that to express what I have, after others called cross-cultural solidarity, would say differing points of view must actually be retained. You don't try and make somebody else like you, even as a result of how you model your behavior, they come to find their own grammar for making themselves also into subjects of the revolution. Maybe even the same revolution, though that's for a different summit.
Thank you so much, everyone, for this very stimulating discussion and conversation. I look forward to continuing these. We need to take a break now. We will be back at 3 and have a very interesting panel ahead. Mark will be chairing with members of the Chicago Humanities Festival on engagement with Chicago's neighborhoods. So I hope I'll see many of you again at 3, and thank you again so much.